Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this new webinar of TEVEA International. We are really happy to welcome you for this last session of 2024. It was a very rich year with a lot of changes in every country, and one of the most important change happened that we need to underline is the ViDA that was finally politically adopted at the last ECOFIN, and we wanted to give you some key to understand how this upcoming reform will be implemented next. Today I am with Etienne.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us.
Etienne is part of the VAT expert team of TEVEA International, such as me, and we covered this subject for many months now, and the idea was to give you some practical views of the rollout of the ViDA plan. Just shortly, we wanted to have a quick overview of what TEVEA is offering. You know, TEVEA is your VAT expert, but we have a range of mission that was extended because of the need of our client and because our client also asked for these services. So now we have organized in 4 global mission. There is the VAT that is part of the Etienne scope, where we offer compliance, VAT refund, monitoring. I hope you have appreciate our new VAT monitoring issues that was lately spread to. You can find it on LinkedIn, so do not hesitate to check it. We have operational assistance. It's right in the subject of today. It's how we can accompany companies to move to e-invoicing, how we can help them to configure, to set up their VAT system, their ERP. That's all our issue on this second global assistance. We also offer environmental taxes, extended producer responsibility, and plastic tax. And for 2 years now, we are able to accompany you on the customs side, of course, how you can secure your transaction out of EU and how you can guarantee the good transition from A to B of your goods without any complication and without any risk. So now we have a global approach, customs and VAT, to secure your transactions. Let's move on into the content of this webinar. So with a rapid overview of what is VAT in the digital age, because I assume if you don't live in an island far from the European Union, you should have heard about ViDA plans. So we don't have a lot of slides on to present ViDA, but it was necessary in case you need to make your ID clear. And of course, we will send the support of this webinar to everyone who is registered. And it will be also available on YouTube and on our LinkedIn page. We will see how the implementation is foreseen in 2025, 27, 28, and 2030. We choose to adopt this calendar form for our webinar that will be easier for you to understand what is coming next. Still in a very practical point of view. And we will end this webinar to talk about what is coming next, what are the different steps And what is in the ID of the VAT expert group, you will see there's a lot of things that still is going to happen. So, Etienne, can you tell us more about ViDA?
So a brief summary of what the ViDA reform is, first of all. So ViDA is a package. It's an ambitious reform that has been presented by the EU Commission back in 2022. And the aim of ViDA, globally said, is to modernize the European VAT system and to simplify it as well as digitalize it mainly. And this is done via three main pillars, as we'll see in the following slides. So three main topics via which this reform is implemented. And the aims of this are to improve the audit efficiency, and also principal aim, of course, is to counter fraud, the VAT gap being still a significant problem in the European Union, as the last report, which has come out yesterday or today, I think, has shown. And this reform will also allow the tax authorities to have real-time data of transactions, which they can have a look at, which also aids towards its aim. And another advantage or another aim, let's say, is to reduce the tax-related burden, the administrative burden for taxpayers, for companies. We of course know that VAT can be fairly complex for taxpayers, so anything that can aid in simplifying it is of course always welcome.
Yeah, you know, harmonization is a very painful process for companies. So it was a little funny to highlight this. Reduce administrative burden, engage a lot of paperwork, IT development, and a lot of cost for company, of course. So three pillars.
As we said, there are three main pillars in the way that the reform will be implemented. The first one is e-invoicing, so electronic invoicing, as well as the electronic reporting, real-time e-reporting that goes with it. The second is there are significant changes in the digital platforms economy and the tax obligations that affect these platforms. And the final one is ways to implement single VAT registrations. So basically giving businesses opportunities to reduce their VAT registration obligations in the European Union when they are active in transactions across different borders. And the plan, the way the reform will be implemented is not yet completely set in stone, because at this stage there is a political agreement, but of course the reform itself still has to be ratified by the EU Parliament, and the legal text as well has to be redacted in the first place. But since we have an agreement between all of the member states, so a unanimous agreement, we can say we already have a solid look at what the reform will look like concretely.
Okay, so now to be concrete, let's talk about the implementation. And we started with next year, 2025 is next year in 10 days. So let's see what will happen in 2025.
So as Pascal said, we're going to have a look at the reform in a chronological manner. So we're going to look at what changes from year to year, what are the relevant changes between 2025 and 2030 and beyond. And it already starts in 2025. So it starts relatively soon, because the first significant change is that member states will be free to devise their own e-invoicing rules starting in 2025 without requiring the derogation from the EU Commission anymore. So the way it was before, member states needed an authorization from the EU Commission in order to implement an e-invoicing system. And this will not be required anymore for their domestic transactions, so transactions that happen within the member state in question. And only between established companies, so companies established within the member states still. Another significant change regards the issuing of electronic invoices, because suppliers in all of the EU will now be free to issue e-invoices starting in 2025. And B2B customers will not be able to refuse these invoices anymore, which means that if you have B2B suppliers and are taxpayers, are a B2B customer, you need to prepare for the eventuality of being able to accept e-invoices starting from 2025.
And be able to accept electronic invoices means also be able to process the electronic invoice, meaning that you need to be able to read the invoice, to implement it in your accountancy. So there are a lot of things to anticipate if invoicing is not already enforced in your country, of course. Let's talk about 2027. 2027 is not far from us, and the idea is to extend to use the one-stop shop that is already available for companies making distance sales to enlarge the scope of the OSS. There are some transactions that are not in the scope of the OSS today, and in 2027, some transactions such as the supplies of natural gas, electricity, and energy will fall into the scope of the OSS. So it is a step to the simplification. For this kind of transaction, you will be able to include it in the OSS scheme and not to register in the country of the supply. So simplification, it is part of the single VAT registration simplification. It's pillar 3, I assume. Yeah. There will also be a new calculation for the distance sales threshold. Today, the threshold is about 10,000 euros, and it aggregates all the distance sales made in the European Union by the company. And in 2027, it is only the distance sales made from the country where the supplier is established that will be taken to the calculation of the threshold. So it means that all the distance sales made from another EU country, if you hold a warehouse, if you use the drop shipping, for example, that will be not into this threshold limit. So we prepare, this slide is an overview, and we also offer you some, oh, I have something strange, just a second. That should be okay. And we prepare another slide just for you as you will receive this support, this PowerPoint presentation after the webinar. It is for you to have more information, but to give you an overview, the extension of the OSS will allow to include the local transaction. It is important. Or today, local transactions are out of the scope of the OSS. You can only declare distance sales, but all distance sales was only distance sales. And tomorrow, if you have a warehouse, for example, you are a German company, you hold a warehouse in Italy, and from this warehouse in Italy, you sell goods to non-taxable bodies in Italy. It is local delivery, it is a local sale. Today, it is out of the scope of the OSS. And in 2028, you will be able to include this kind of transaction into the OSS. So it means there is simplification for you, because if you hold different warehouse in the EU, you need VAT registration in this country, because the transfer of the goods from your country to this warehouse trigger the VAT registration in the country of arrival. You have to declare an intra-EU acquisition and then a local delivery to the final customer. With the extension of the scope of the OSS, it will be no longer necessary because the OSS will also be able to include your transaction when you transfer the goods to this warehouse. If you transfer goods from Germany to Italy and then you sell locally to private customers, you will not need to be VAT registered in Italy. All this transaction will be included in the OSS. So it is an important change. Today, the OSS only simplify transaction for companies providing goods from one country and distributing goods to all the customers in the EU. Tomorrow, there will be another simplification, and it is in the idea of the single VAT registration, is pillar 3, to extend the scope of the OSS. And in the same idea, the call of stock simplification will also be no longer necessary, as you don't need to register in the country of arrival to declare.
Yeah, it becomes redundant with the extension of the OSS system, and therefore it wouldn't be needed anymore. The extension of the OSS to particularly the supply and installation of goods and the transfer of companies' own goods to other countries is an interesting possibility, because these are typically activities that can trigger usually obligations to register in a given country, and that taxpayers and companies are not always aware of. For example, companies that have an activity of rental of goods, for example, construction machinery or vehicles, they will typically bring their equipment to another country in order to make rentals or such activities. And these are transactional flows that can trigger registrations without the taxpayers being necessarily aware of that. So big things are changing in 2028 in terms of single VAT registration. We also have a generalization of the reverse charge rules. So the reverse charge, it is a rule at the EU level, of course, but it has vast differences between member states, and it can often be difficult to determine how the reverse charge applies from one member state to another. What ViDA will change in this sense is that it will make certain parameters of the reverse charge mandatory, still leaving a certain margin for member states in their application of the reverse charge, of course. But from then on, from 2028 onwards, all B2B domestic transactions that are made by a non-established supplier will be in principle subject to the reverse charge. So that should make it simpler for foreign suppliers that have transactions in other countries in order to avoid having to register in said countries, because it pushes the liability for the applicable VAT onto the local customer.
Okay, and just a word, it was planned to extend the deemed supplier scheme that is currently in force for marketplaces to make them liable for the VAT for the EU vendor. Currently, marketplaces are liable for VAT when the underlying supplier is out of the EU. Marketplaces have to declare the distance sales. We are talking about B2C transaction. Marketplaces are liable for VAT for all distance sales and local sales in the EU that are carried out by non-established supplier and sell through the marketplaces. And it was an idea to extend the marketplace liability to EU vendor, but it is removed of the plan. So the only case where marketplaces will be liable for VAT is when the underlying supplier, is out of the EU, or for all distance sales of imported goods. That is the current application of the e-commerce reform. So no changes for 2028. But
in 2030,
okay,
let's move on maybe. Two significant changes. So one in terms of the online platforms that we just mentioned, especially platforms that facilitate the sale of passenger transport or short-term accommodation. For these platforms, the deemed supply rules become mandatory. Short-term accommodations is accommodation that lasts for less than 30 days. I think we all have a platform in mind that sells that. I'm not going to name it. And there's also the e-invoicing rules that become mandatory for all B2B and B2G transactions within the EU. So if we move on to the further side, the more detailed slide. So as you can see, for short-term accommodation rental platforms, as well as passenger transport platforms, the deemed supplier rules that we may already be familiar with that apply to platforms that facilitate the sale of goods, they now apply. Another consequence of this is that this also excludes the TOMS, the tour operator margin scheme, for these platforms. So the platforms that are concerned by these activities will not be able to resort to the margin scheme that applies to tour operators. And what this means for these platforms is that because they become the supplier, they are the ones that are liable for the invoicing and for collecting the VAT on these transactions. So it changes the identity of the suppliers for these services, which is very important. And it makes the platforms the suppliers of the services in question. This is not a strictly mandatory system in the sense that member states have a margin of 10 years to change the parameters. They can exclude some of the platforms. For example, they can exclude platforms that are already registered either in the country in question or by the OSS. And in the sense they can just continue to report the VAT. And there is also different VAT registration scheme, which is called for SMEs, small companies, which can also be applied alternatively.
So it means that when the underlying supplier is already VAT registered and declared, the platform will not be liable. And if the underlying supplier is registered under this special scheme, simplification scheme, the platform will not be liable, but it is the member state to choose to opt out for this exclusion for this supplier. So this is very important. A lot of challenges to identify the transaction, to see what are in the scope of the marketplace, how you can track this transaction to be sure to be the one who collects the VAT and to be compliant with the requirement. It's an important challenge. Marketplaces are still in the scope of the EU. The EU wants to make them liable for a lot of transactions as they offer the possibility to any supplier to sell to any client. So the EU idea is to make them liable for transaction. So this is a long-term analysis from an IT point of view. It is important to qualify the data to be sure of what you can collect as data from your supplier and the client to be able to fully automate this transaction in your IT system. In 2030, there will be the implementation of the mandatory digital reporting requirements. This DRR will be focused on very specific transactions that are under the reverse charge mechanism when the supplier is not established, because there are still reverse charge mechanisms on local transaction when the supplier is established for a specific sector. But now we are talking about reverse charge mechanism when the supplier is not established. This transaction will have to be reported digitally to EU. All the intra-EU transactions, goods and services, will be reported to the EU. That means it will be the end of the European sales list. Today, the European sales list is an additional return that is required from companies that carry out EU transaction, and it allows some cross-checking. And with the digital reporting requirement, it will not be necessary anymore. All these transactions will be directly reported at an EU level, and all this check could be done automatically. Triangular transaction also, it is important when you have a company in a member states sending goods to another member state and invoicing a company in a third member state. This is triangular transaction that need to be cross-checked. You need to check where the VAT is due and who is invoicing who. This triangular transaction then will be reported at an EU level with the digital reporting requirement that will allow to check that everything is in order. And also B2B supplies of energy, that will be a specific report for this kind of transaction in 2030. So you see there are a lot of transactions that are currently done by companies, and from the country, in the country where the e-invoicing is in force, it is usually only the domestic transactions that are in the scope of the invoicing. There are some exceptions. I think about Poland in February 2026. In Poland, all transactions will have to be e-reported. But now it is only on domestic transaction that the mandatory e-invoicing is in force. So tomorrow you need to include all this transaction in the reporting and be able to collect and to keep proof of all this transaction. It's not because the invoice is electronic and the reporting is electronic that you don't need to keep proof of this transaction. It's the reliable audit trail. You need to be able, when you have an audit, to prove that the transaction corresponds to an economic movement. So it doesn't prevent you from this mandatory archiving of all those supporting documents. The DRR will have to be submitted 10 days after the issuance of the electronic invoice. It's very short period, 10 days. It was initially 2 working days.
It's even shorter.
So we have 8 days of benefits, but it is quite short. So it is all 90 challenge. Transaction are almost in real time. So everything needs to be smooth. I mean, from an IT point of view, to be able to meet this requirement, this short-term requirement. In 2035, so not today, but the day after tomorrow, all domestic e-invoice system shall be harmonized to the ViDA standard. You have European standard EN 16934, and the directive also provide technical information on how to report the electronic invoices. So today, member states that are engaged in the process of e-invoicing already started this process, or it is already in force, will have to converge to an harmonization of this electronic invoicing system format and reporting. You have syntactic and how the message, the structured message is sent to the tax authority. And of course, this digital reporting requirement is based on the mandatory electronic invoicing. So in 2030, mandatory electronic invoicing for all the transactions that are listed above. So it comes in addition to the domestic transaction between established company. The idea is to report everything and have pre-completed information, pre-completed VAT return to guarantee the VAT collection and prevent the fraud. 2 words for French company. There is a specific ViDA information allowing the third-party invoicing provider to authorize them, to issue the invoices. So it means that in France we have accredited partner that will ensure the collection and the transmission of electronic information to the tax authority. And this scheme is compatible with ViDA, so there is no need to change everything. And there was also a lot of discussion about recapitulative invoices. So now the agreement is okay. The recapitulative invoices will still be acceptable. It was part of the negotiation. There are some conditions, but keep in mind that these recapitulative invoices are still acceptable in the future.
Another important factor for France is that the electronic invoicing will have to be done via a partner. Yep. Companies will not be able to issue invoices themselves, but they must do so via the mandating of a certified partner, PDPs as they are called, which means that companies that are concerned by e-invoicing obligations in France in due time will have to look for a partner with the right conditions, with the right contractual requirements, and so that they're ready for when the e-invoicing obligations enter into force in France, which brings us we have a quick the next point map, a reference map of the e-invoicing provisions that either have already come into force in the EU or have already been announced. So in orange, you can see the countries that already have e-invoicing provisions. So these are Romania, Hungary, and Italy, with the peculiarity for Romania that non-established companies that have a taxable activity in Romania, so that are registered in Romania, they are also subject to e-invoicing rules. This is quite unique, at least so far in the EU. It's not typical for non-established companies to be subject to domestic e-invoicing rules, but for Romania that is the case. So it is something to anticipate, of course, for companies that plan to have an activity in Romania and having to register on that basis. Regarding the countries in pink, these are the countries that have already announced the introduction of an e-invoicing system. Of course, the introduction of an e-invoicing system eventually it regards every EU member state. Even the countries in gray, just because they're in gray, it does not mean they won't have an electronic invoicing system. But the pink ones are the ones that have already set a date. And these are Spain, France, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Croatia, and Slovenia. They have announced their introduction at various dates. For example, in France is in September 2026, and Poland, as Pascal just said, is in February 2026. So relatively soon, in relative terms. There is another particularity for Estonia, I think, in that customers, Estonian customers will be able to request electronic invoices from their suppliers. So this is kind of a reversal of the 2025 measure that we spoke about earlier, where from 2025, suppliers will be able to impose electronic invoices on their B2B customers. In Estonia, there will also be the reverse case. So the reversal will also be true in that B2B customers will be able to request that the supplier issue electronic invoices. So that is another obligation to look out for.
So it is interesting because we talked earlier about harmonization, and you see, as long as member states have room to transpose the directive, it is always very complicated. Each country has its own very not easy, and we have to keep monitoring all these changes to anticipate them and be ready in time. So what next? What next? Etienne, want to say something?
So the proposals at this point, we have a political agreement regarding ViDA, so an agreement between the member states, as has been made during the last ECOFIN Council, but it's not yet set in stone, as we said in the beginning. Why? Because the reform still needs to be approved by the EU Parliament in the first place. And then, of course, it also needs to be written in the form of a legal text and eventually approved by the Council as well. So we have a fairly solid basis to go from and to know what what taxpayers have to do within the next 5-10 years. But it's not necessarily definitive, and there are things that may change. That being said, we already have significant changes coming in from 2025 onwards. So taxpayers definitely have new obligations to look forward to into that. Well, obligations not necessarily, but new parameters, let's say, to look forward to beginning in 2025.
Yeah, and because the issue of the political agreement was on Pillar 2, that was the platform economy. In July, the EU Commission has already started workshop on Pillar 3, because even if there is an agreement, the implementation of this ViDA plan is not done yet. We have we need operational guidance that are still in process. So there are a lot of workshops that will start to check how we can, now we reach to an agreement, but how we can meet all these requirements and what will be the challenge for businesses to meet this requirement. So EU Commission has initiated a lot of workshop on the different pillar. Pillar 3 is the one who reached the first one on this one. But now the political agreement is complete for all the pillar. There will be soon other workshop on the other pillar.
Maybe a closing just an additional note maybe regarding so of course European companies and taxpayers, they have these significant changes that they have to anticipate, but this does not necessarily mean that non-EU companies are not concerned. Depending on the case, depending on their activities within the European Union, they may also have to determine whether they are concerned by these changes or not. I'm thinking notably in terms of permanent establishment or fixed establishment in that can trigger obligations that are the same as if the company were an EU company. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you're an non-EU company, you are not concerned by these rules in the absolute. There may be some analysis to be done depending on your activity, and especially whether you have activities within the EU.
Thank you, Etienne. There are fresh information. Last 13th of December, the VAT expert group formed a working group thinking about the future of VAT. So ViDA is now in process. It is agreed, now it is in the implementing phase. So what is the future of VAT? The VAT expert group think about additional simplification, extending the exemption scheme, the simplification rule or derogation of the VAT directive. Also think about how VAT can be a tool to support the EU environmental objectives. So green VAT, it is an important objective at an EU level. So maybe that can be a part of it to help companies to be greener, and also how we can use digitalization to improve more the collection of the VAT, to tackle fraud, of course, to allow to recover the input VAT in the OSS, because it was not focused on that, but keep in mind that OSS is only devoted to output transaction, but not to input transactions. So you may still have to submit VAT reform claim to recover local VAT. So this is something that is in the mind of the working group of the VEG. So this is the next step, and they are looking for what will be VAT in 2050. So it is not tomorrow, but it will come quite rapidly. All right, I think we reached the end of our webinar. I have another technical issue. Oh, let me show you. It doesn't work. Okay. Oh, yes, I think it's good. So we would like to thank you for attending this meeting, this webinar. It was a pleasure to host this with Etienne. It is very interesting to share all this key and all this point of view with you. And of course, we remain at your disposal if you need more information, if you have questions about what was said, about how you plan to do. We can have a discussion about your next step for you, your company, how it will be impacted by ViDA, and what you need to do first to do the map of the transaction, to see what transactions are eligible, to what kind of report, what kind of data you need, all this of a transaction, all this mission. We can help you, we can assist you to do that.
We will also send the slides to all of the participants. You will receive the slides in the next few days normally. And of course, if you have any questions at all, do not hesitate to reach out to us, and we will be in touch as soon as possible.
Good. So we wish you a great festive season. Enjoy your holidays if you have some. And we will see you in 2025.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.